I'm LaShawn. I support moms who are empty nesters who are navigating parental estrangement by prioritizing your accountability, your healing, your self-care, and your commitment to lifelong learning. This month, for the month of March, as promised, we are venturing into discussion of the Pillar 1, which is accountability. We built the Matriarch community on 4 pillars. That's accountability, healing, self-care, and lifelong learning. So with this month being spring, I challenged the community at the beginning, well, the second to the last day in February, where we ended off doing 28 days of self-love affirmations. One of the challenges was using the metaphor or some symbolism and how or what type of flower you were going to, what type of flower you've chosen to become, and then looking for all of the 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 environments that that flower grows in, that it needs to be nurtured in, that it thrives in, and then using those as metaphors to um, look at our lives and see how we are, living in our lives personally, on a personal level, right? And one of the things I discussed was it's important for us to be honest with ourselves. We can cheat, we can, pretend, we can put up appearances for anyone else. But when we cheat ourselves, that's where that's a big problem, a real big problem. Because if you aren't being authentic, then you're going to, live in misery. That's just simple. Now, I just want to get that part out of the way. The reason that I'm making this video is because this is part of Pillar 1 of accountability, but it's the most important one um, of you know, the bullet points that fall underneath accountability in Pillar 1. And that is when we come to terms with how we have been a tool for harm for our adult children in their childhood. And a lot of times people don't want to do this part of it because, well, I'll use myself as an example. Navigating this portion of parental estrangement was difficult for me because I knew I had worked so hard to change so many of the patterns that had existed in my family prior to me becoming a mom and coming to understand how difficult a job that is, but also being a divorced parent, right? And knowing that I had really worked hard in my mind, I had really worked hard on changing a lot of the things that were, that my mom had a chance to change from her mom. And I always say this, we have to be mindful that this is not an easy part of the journey, right? The part where we learn how we weren't the perfect parent. We weren't the parent that our child need or our children needed. And each child is different, right? And they don't tell you this at the beginning of your parenting. This isn't something that people discuss with you, that if you have more than one child, there's more than one need. That your way of parenting, even though you may have changed some things that were not the best method of parenting from your childhood, those things may not be enough. They may not have been modified enough. And I'll be honest with you, as a Gen Xer, we didn't have a lot of the tools that are present today. We didn't have a lot of examples to show us where the parenting fails were or how to correct them, right? And so I'm not making an excuse for it. It doesn't change that some of the parenting patterns that we adopted and brought into our own parenting still were outdated and antiquated. One of them being discipline. I was a corporal punishment parent. I believe that spare the rod, spoil the child. And although I modified the way that I use corporal parenting punishment, it was still harmful to my children, right? And then when I looked back and saw it through their eyes, I'm like, you were expecting a lot from them, right? You were expecting them to be at home by themselves and be able to, you know, keep the door locked, not go outside. All those things that we were taught as Gen Xers that we thought were normal but really weren't, due to systemic and structural systems of racism that created these situations where parents had to leave their children at home and go into the workforce, right? And so being a divorced parent, that became part of my story where I needed to go into the workforce. I needed to work multiple jobs. And although I thought I was doing a good job of raising 4 children alone, working 3 jobs, working 2 jobs, going to school, I thought that my children were thriving. I knew that they missed me. I did know that. But I also knew that I was doing a lot, and I thought I was doing the best, right? And when I look back at that time, a lot of my time in parenting was spent in survival mode. You know, making sure this bill gets paid, making sure this kid gets the money they need for, you know, sports or after school activities or daycare and childcare. And all those things are juggling, right? We're juggling all these things. And at the same time, trying to be emotionally, mentally, and spiritually present for our children. And it's an impossible feat. It truly is. But what the most important thing is to be able to see that, to understand that that was a difficult time, right? To understand that there are systems at play that can create those environments or those needs, right? For parents to have to be present, for parents to not be present, but still having to work and then finding time to be able to care for their children. And I'll be talking about that more as we get further along in the I'm Not Cutting Me Off Too campaign, because systemic and structural racism plays a huge part. And that doesn't matter. It does matter. I won't say that doesn't matter. But what I will say is it doesn't only impact Black families. It doesn't only impact Black, Indigenous, and people of color, right? That's a very sensitive topic because there are still privileges that people, non-Black individuals, and with extreme exceptions to those who happen to be white parents or white persons who get to benefit more from the systems that are in play meant to benefit them, okay? And anyone who knows me, and if you've been here long enough, I have this conversation often. I'm not gonna sugarcoat anything. But getting back to my point where what I'm making about our taking accountability for our parenting and how it may have harmed, how it may have caused, long-term scarring, okay? And many of us, yes, we've experienced our long-term scarring. We've had our own childhood traumas, whether it be intentional from our parents or as a result of systems in place. It doesn't change that that's painful. And so it's important for us as parents to understand that although we may have intended well, we may have intended that we were being the good parent, that we changed some things around that may have been different in our childhood, that doesn't mean that it was still impactful for our children, okay? And I say this too, it's important to remember this too, because people say, well, I don't know what happened. The other kid, they didn't have that kind of childhood. They didn't feel that way about it. So why can't they just fall in line and be like everybody else and understand that this is what I was going through and I did the best I could with what I had? You may have done the best you could with what you have. You may have. But it doesn't change the fact that maybe, just maybe it wasn't enough for one of your children. Maybe it was not enough to fulfill what they had, that they needed inside, okay? And so sometimes we have to be mindful of that, right? And not use one child as a measure for all of our children, right? Oh, well, so-and-so didn't have that experience. You were in the same house. I don't understand how you had a different experience. It happens. Even people who are, what do you call them, or child psychiatrists, psychologists, these people have challenges as well. Parenting is not an easy thing. It's not. It's not an easy part of life. It isn't. It's a lot of learning as you go, and learning and evolving, and then coming to terms with how we have to change and modify our parenting styles. I used an example before with another parent I was talking to about how I came to the realization that I wasn't the best parent I could have been to each of my children. They individually needed something different, right? And so I've used an example of working in your job, and the way you can address a manager, right, may be different than the way you can address a director. The way you address your coworker may be different than you address your vendor, right? It's just a different way. Learning the language, right? You're getting the language, because not every person interprets language the same way, right? Some of our children can be highly sensitive. Some of our children can be pretty self-efficient, I guess I want to say. They can appear to be more efficient on their own and not need so much of our help, right? But see, those are the ones that we miss. Those are the ones that fall on the wayside while we pour into the other children who may need more, right? Who may need more time, who may need us to go to the school more, who may need us to we all have children who needed more of our attention, who maybe didn't need as much structure or needed more structure, right? And so as parents, we don't get that that level of training, right? We get training for, jobs. We get training for CPR, mental health, first aid, things of that nature. None of those things were really available. Mental health first aid wasn't when I was coming up as a parent and raising my children. Another factor being a young parent, right? I was very young when I got married. We got married for the wrong reasons, for cultural reasons, and it should not have been that way, but that's how it happened. And that happens a lot for parents. You become a parent and you aren't equipped. You don't have what it takes yet. And there are parents that all over the world that are having children born to them today, and they are of the mindset, oh, I got this. I know how I was parented. I know how I'm not gonna parent, right? And so that we have to come to terms with, that's not enough. It's not. It's a part of it. It's a part that motivates us to do the research, to work on ourselves, to pour into ourselves so that we feel good about who we are, and that translates into how we communicate with our children, right? I use as an example, too, a lot of times with other Gen Xers when I'm talking about how our parenting styles reflected those of the boomer generation, and how our children, who happen to be the millennials and the Gen Zers, and I think the A's now, I think it's the A's, these children have way more information than we did. We didn't have the internet. We didn't have accessibility to psychologists and psychiatrists online talking about cultural and social and family generational traumas and all those things. We didn't have those luxuries of being able to identify, hey, that sounds like my family. That sounds like a pattern that was in my family. That sounds like something that happened to me. And these are the tools. And oh, I can get therapy. Oh, I can talk to someone about this. There's someone who's knowledgeable about this. They have more information. And so they have every right to be angry, right? Every right to be angry about how their parenting or their childhood was. Why? because a lot of the things that happened were survival for a lot of us parents. And that survival mode it created a deficiency. It created a deficiency in the actual presence of parents, right? A lot of us weren't able to be fully present with our children because we're constantly thinking about what the next thing is we need to be doing to ensure we keep a roof over their heads, keep them fed, keep them safe, keep them clothed. All those things were factors that were constantly pulling at the resources for us being parents, and for our children to grow up and then meet other parents who had accessibility to those resources, had accessibility to coaching, had accessibility to parents who may have done the work prior to their generation, learned some things, passed them on, may have had parents who were psychologists or within the health field that had more information and were able to be better informed, and therefore they passed on new patterns, right? Passed on new coping skills, new practices, as in learning more, researching more, having an ability to understand and to communicate better with their children, right? To understand fully what their children needed. And so to know that that was out there, and that I'm just speaking in their in third person, I guess. To know that that was available and that your parents did not take advantage of it, that would make you pretty pissed off. But not knowing that the parents didn't have that as an option, didn't know it existed, or had the wrong tools given to them. And I'll talk more about that in my experience and seeking out counselors for our family, and at the time therapists, and being told something totally out of the ordinary, not out of the ordinary, but I'll just say that our therapists and counselors at that time were not African American or Black. I identify as Black. And they did not identify with our cultural needs. They didn't know how to talk to us about our children and all the different factors that were being contributing to a lack and contributing to more stress and our inability to be able to both be present with our children and in survival mode, trying to keep our families out of poverty and being homeless and et cetera, right? And so with that being said, the tools that our children needed us to have, we couldn't have them at that time because one, either didn't know they existed, or two, didn't have the money for them, or three, just didn't have the resources left for them, or chose not to use them, right? So those are reasons for anyone to be pretty upset, right? That I could have had my life be different if my parent were willing to do the work. And so understanding and appreciating that, even if that is not your story, right? What this really boils down to is coming to terms with how, even though our intent could have been love and protection and provision and providing for our children, it could have still been lacking in what they needed. Our presence is very important. And many of us who had to work outside the home, who had to take on more than one job, that meant that we were absent. And for a child, that's important. That means that the times that we should have been available to them, the times that we could have been more emotionally involved, that they didn't get what they needed. And that we, at the time, even though we wanted to, may not have been able to be that for them because we had to be something else. We had to be the provider. We had to be the protector. And so this comes down to, how do we receive that when our child comes to us and says, you weren't there for me. You weren't what I needed. How do we receive that and then have the understanding that because I accept this as their truth does not mean that it was intentional on my behalf. How do I accept this as their truth? Okay? How do you accept that as your child's truth? But also come to an understanding that I would have did it if I'd known I needed to. I would have did it if I had the ability to. Both can be true. You can both appreciate where your child is coming from, and then appreciate why that was what happened. Okay. The most important portion of your healing is to be able to receive feedback from your children who may have been harmed by you as their parent, whether it was directly intentional or indirectly and unintentional. It still happened. And so as the parent, can you say to yourself, I didn't mean that, but I can understand where my child is coming from and that they're hurting, and that it is up to me to be part of their healing. Because although we can apologize, although we can be present, although we can go to therapy with them as adults, although we can do the work on ourselves to come to an understanding, and at the same time understand that it's going to take them some time to get to a place where they can hear and understand your heart and know that it was in the right place. You just didn't know how to properly execute it, right? Until they get to that point, they're going to require some patience. They're going to lash out. They're going to be angry. They're going to be hurt. And as a parent, that's the most difficult part of this journey, that you have to be there and know that although you may have caused the harm, you didn't want it to be that way, and there were things you had to do in order to make life good for your children, they still caused harm. You have to be willing to say, I understand, and I'm sorry, and I wish things were different. I wish I could have did different. But at the same time, you have to be willing to hold on to yourself. And when I say hold on to yourself, there's nothing more painful than to work your whole life, adult life as a parent, and not have anything to show for it other than you were able to survive and get your babies through. And then to be finding out at the end of that, it wasn't enough. That's painful. But at the same time, this pattern doesn't change. It doesn't stop until you get to the point where you can say, I can receive what my child is saying to me. I can receive that, and I can work with them towards their healing of what my contribution was, right? But at the same time, be willing to say, there were systems in place that created the need for me to work 2 and 3 jobs. There were systems in place that I wasn't able to give them extra this or extra that because the money had to go towards keeping them housed, fed, and healthy, or medical, right? And so all of those things have to continuously be happening at the beginning of your journey. They're going to feel like you're right back where you were when you were that parent trying to figure it out and things were not falling into place. And all of those emotions, all of that stress, all of that pressure, it all comes back to the surface again. The point being, if you need to get assistance with learning how to process that, the best way to do that is through a therapist. Someone who can sit down with you, help you work through your feelings, help you to understand them, help you to understand the feelings of your children, but also help you, as you may have watched in my Accountability 1, Pillar 1 accountability video that I did. It was actually a short little discussion I had on TikTok, and then I moved it around on all of the other apps that you caught that talked about not being a doormat. That's going to be a very necessary discussion to have, and it was why I did that first. because I want you to know that although you want to be accountable and you want to be mindful of your children's heart and their mind and their viewpoint of how your parenting affected them, you also don't want it used as a tool against you to the point of your financial demise, right? We don't want that to happen. We want you to be able to process what happened, process what your part in that is, and sometimes you need therapy to have someone to be there as a neutral individual to help you to work through what your portion of that responsibility is, okay? So that you fully understand where your accountability lies and how you at that point can execute the necessary steps to work on your relationship with your child, but also not be exploited as a result, okay? That's important, very important. But I wanted to come in today and have that discussion with you that the accountability portion of this journey is going to be the most difficult one, and that it is going to require you to dig deep, to dig past your justifications, even though they may be founded, right? Even though it may be justified that you had to work and there was no money for daycare and your children had to stay home. It doesn't change that that was very terrifying for babies, right? For those babies to be home alone. That was terrifying for them to not know if you were safe or you were coming home, or if they were safe, or if they were going to be able to keep their home, housing insecurity. I'm going to get into all of that, because when you understand all of the factors, when you understand how much was out of your control, it helps you to be able to work through that part of your life with less judgment and guilt and grief, okay? And so I'm hoping that I try to keep these short videos to 30 minutes, because if you have to watch them during your lunch break or in the evening, or any short time, I try to keep it as informational as I can. At the same time, I want to be able to get through and talk with you about this journey in the most transparent way possible. But at the same time, I want it to be mindful of your heart and where you are as a parent and how you're growing and how you've arrived at this space, and how you've even decided to come into these videos and take the risk and say, let me see what this is about. Let me see if there's something here I can take from this so that I can create better for myself and better for my family and future generations, right? Because ultimately that's the goal. The Matriarch Code, the Matriarch community, that's what we're building. We're building better us for the future generations. And that doesn't happen easily. This is a job that requires a spirit, the spirit that you have contained in you because you've raised those babies, right? It requires a warrior spirit for this portion of your life. And it requires a spirit of endurance, right? And a love for learning. Even if you don't have that at this point, you will nurture it by the end of this journey. When you get to the middle, and I won't say the end of this journey, because I personally believe that we don't end this journey. We don't. It's one of constant evolution. You're constantly evolving, constantly learning more. And if you want to be better for your children and you want the future generations to be better, that's the only way it's going to happen. Everyone has to be invested in bettering and being present and being what they need to be for themselves first, and then to everyone else. Thank you for coming in. I hope to see you again, and I hope something here was helpful to you and helps you on your journey. Bye for now.